Imagine walking through a modern American city late at night. You pass by gleaming glass skyscrapers, tree-lined residential neighborhoods with immaculate gardens, and then within the span of just a few city blocks, you cross an invisible boundary into a district marked by crumbling infrastructure, shuttered storefronts, and neglected schools. You glance at the people living in these two adjacent worlds and notice a stark, undeniable pattern. The demographic boundaries match economic privilege and systemic hardship with eerie precision. When we witness deep-seated structural inequality in our daily lives, our minds naturally search for an explanation. We want a narrative that resolves the tension. When most people try to answer this question, they default to one of two comfortable narratives. The first treats racial injustice as a dry, distant timeline of historical events safely buried in history textbooks. The second treats racial prejudice as a simple moral defect of individual bad actors who chose to hate. Both allow us to sleep peacefully at night by assuring us that the problem belongs to someone else. The truth is stranger, far more unsettling, and deeply psychological. Millions of years ago, human beings evolved in small, tightly knit tribes. To survive in a world of scarce resources and predatory danger, the human brain developed rapid threat detection software that automatically categorized anyone who looked, spoke, or acted differently as a dangerous outgroup threat. When that cognitive machinery is combined with immense economic temptation and political power, the mind seeks to protect its own comfort by projecting threat onto the vulnerable. This diagram maps out the predictable repeating psychological pipeline of discrimination. Othering leads to stereotyping. Stereotyping leads to dehumanization. Dehumanization leads to scapegoating. Scapegoating leads to institutionalization. Institutionalization leads to normalization, and normalization persists until broken by courageous resistance. Racial injustice in America operates as a carefully engineered, repeating psychological system, one designed to prioritize in-group comfort by projecting threat onto the vulnerable. Consider the early colonial founders. In the 1600s, European indentured servants and African laborers worked side by side in Virginia tobacco fields under harsh, near-identical conditions. In 1676, a joint rebellion of poor European servants and African workers burned Jamestown to the ground. Terrified by this united working-class uprising, the wealthy colonial elite realized they needed a psychological wedge to break solidarity. They systematically created the legal and social category of whiteness, granting poor European workers small privileges, while condemning African workers to permanent, hereditary enslavement. When human leaders invest immense capital and power into exploiting others, their brains struggle to admit mistake. Admitting that you are torturing or stealing land from another human being purely for monetary gain creates intolerable psychological agony, a condition psychologists call cognitive dissonance. To resolve this dissonance, the human mind invents a comforting lie. During the era of chattel slavery, Southern theologians preached that God ordained bondage to civilize heathens, while pseudoscientists fabricated theories to prove lower intelligence. Similarly, during the forced removal of Native American nations along the Trail of Tears, society embraced manifest destiny, the self-righteous belief that God had commanded white settlers to replace populations who were supposedly wasting the wilderness. The victims were framed as spiritual curses or nomadic barriers. State legislatures passed strict blood quantum statutes like the one-drop rule, declaring that any person with even one distant African ancestor was legally black and subject to enslavement. Racial categories were arbitrary social constructs engineered solely to maximize slaveholder property rights and enforce rigid tribal partitioning. This moral contradiction extended far beyond the South. Northern banks underwrote mortgages on enslaved human beings, northern textile mills processed slave-grown cotton, and northern shipping companies transported the commodities. Financial self-interest created a nationwide moral blindness. To maintain self-esteem, Enslavers and their financiers had to double down on racial ideology, compartmentalizing their personal morality from the institutional brutality they profited from. Dehumanization is an essential psychological defense mechanism. Oppressors must erase the humanity of their victims from their moral accounting. By convincing themselves the victim is naturally inferior, they transform cruel exploitation into a moral necessity. By 1850, the federal government enacted the Fugitive Slave Act. This forced Northern marshals and ordinary citizens to capture escaped slaves under penalty of fine and imprisonment. By legally mandating that Northern citizens become slave catchers, the federal state forced the entire nation into active participation, attempting to normalize human capture as a routine civic duty. Carl Jung observed that every human mind contains a shadow, the subconscious repository of repressed impulses, guilt, greed, and unacceptable desires. When individuals or whole societies refuse to acknowledge their own internal shadow, they engage in psychological projection. They project their own disowned dark traits onto a defenseless minority group. Following the collapse of Reconstruction, panic over lost white supremacy drove Southern states to pass black codes and Jim Crow laws to strip Black Americans of voting rights and enforce segregation in all public spaces. Forcing Black citizens to drink from separate water fountains or step off sidewalks was designed to visually and psychologically enforce perpetual inferiority. This status anxiety frequently erupted into state-sanctioned violence. In 1921, white mobs destroyed 35 blocks of the prosperous Greenwood district in Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street. They murdered up to 300 Black residents and burned luxury homes, exposing how white economic envy targeted and destroyed Black economic independence. Economic panic consistently activates xenophobia. During the severe depression of the 1870s, working-class Americans felt financially threatened, and their brains switched from universal empathy to tribal resource guarding. Politicians diverted public anger away from wealthy railroad barons and directed it toward defenseless Chinese laborers, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the bureaucratic cruelty of interrogations at checkpoints like Angel Island. Decades later, wartime hysteria and agricultural land envy drove the government to authorize Japanese-American internment. Over 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry were forced into remote, barbed wire desert camps without charges or trials. The government stripped them of individual identity, treating an entire ethnic group as a singular internal enemy. The supreme contradiction of this era was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Young Japanese American men volunteered from internment camps to fight in Europe, suffering massive casualties to rescue trapped American forces abroad, while their own families remained locked behind domestic barbed wire. Societies trapped themselves in systemic racism by using minority groups as scapegoat mirrors. When a leader built a pedestal in the mud, they refused to admit their own foundation is flawed. Instead, they pointed at a stranger and blamed them for the dirt. It protects their fragile collective ego from facing the cold reality of their own corruption. In the 20th and 21st centuries, racism evolved. It shifted from explicit public violence into quiet bureaucratic algorithms, zoning laws, and banking policies. Injustice became built into the everyday background architecture of society. Take the practice of redlining. In the 1930s, the federal government drew literal red lines on city maps around Black and minority neighborhoods, deeming them hazardous investments. By denying minority families access to home ownership mortgages, the government systematically engineered a massive multi-generational racial wealth gap, all while subsidizing white suburban development. The human mind craves the just world fallacy, the psychological need to believe the world is inherently fair and that people get what they deserve. When confronted with this engineered wealth gap, people clinging to the just world fallacy blamed the victims of redlining for their poverty, rather than acknowledging inherited systemic barriers. When a privileged group perceives that an oppressed group is gaining equal rights, they experience that equality as a direct threat to their social status. Despite the Supreme Court outlawing segregated schools, millions of white families abandoned integrated public education, moving to unincorporated suburbs in a phenomenon known as white flight. This graph compares the rates of drug usage across racial lines. The data consistently demonstrates that Black and white Americans use and sell drugs at perfectly equal rates, but the war on drugs utilized coded enforcement. Drastic policies like the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine fueled an enforcement bias that incarcerated Black Americans at nearly 6 times the rate of white Americans. This is institutional normalization. When injustice is encoded into the rules of society, citizens no longer need to hold conscious personal malice to perpetuate harm. They simply need to follow standard procedures. Imagine watching a polished 2-minute trailer for a blockbuster film, promising liberty and equal opportunity for all. Official national rhetoric is that polished trailer. But when you sit through the unedited history of racial discrimination, you discover the complex, brutal 3-hour film where promises were systematically denied to half the cast. It is easy to look back at 4 centuries of racial atrocities and feel a comfortable sense of moral superiority. We sit in our modern living rooms and imagine we would have stood up as heroes, but we all carry the exact same evolutionary cognitive machinery that built those hierarchies. We naturally favor our in-group, we subconsciously absorb cultural stereotypes. We protect our comfort when resources feel scarce. David Foster Wallace once told a story about 2 young fish who meet an older fish. The older fish says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" Eventually, one young fish looks at the other and asks, "What the hell is water?" Systemic racism, implicit bias, and inherited cultural stereotypes are that water. We swim in them every single day. History does not ask us to feel performative guilt. It demands metacognition, the deliberate, painful practice of observing our own minds. Self-awareness is the willingness to step out of the water, embrace the discomfort of being wrong, and actively dismantle the biases we all carry. The historical normalization of oppression was only ever broken by the final stage of the psychological pipeline: courageous, active resistance. Abolitionists and escaped enslaved people forced the state to confront its own cruelty. During the civil rights movement, leaders transformed systemic trauma into nonviolent moral clarity. By marching peacefully, they exposed the hidden brutality of legal segregation to the world. The wise society does not build concrete walls of tribal prejudice to keep out everyone who looks or speaks differently. We possess absolute responsibility for our own minds and the future of our shared society. Evolutionary prejudice is a trap we are all born into. Practicing moral clarity and empathy represents a final conscious control over our own minds. Examine your own life, clean your internal mirror, and grant complexity to the world.